Now, during the previous lecture, we discussed different ways of classifying the nervous system into different parts. We said we can classify it like voluntary and involuntary, somatic and visceral, and central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. There are different ways in which you can classify the nervous system. Then we also said that in our discussions, we like to classify the nervous system as the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And we also said that the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord, which are in the center, and as well as they are the main part of the nervous system. Then the peripheral nervous system includes 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So we discussed all that. Then the brain is inside the cranial cavity. Now, if I draw it, the cranial cavity would be like this. So the brain is inside the cranial cavity, and the brain stem ends roughly at the level of the foramen magnum here, where the spinal cord starts. And the spinal cord is inside the vertebral canal of the vertebral column. So this is how it is. So you have the brain inside the cranial cavity and the vertebral column inside the vertebral canal. So the brain is covered with meninges. Meninges are coverings around the brain and around the spinal cord for protection. There are several layers of meninges. There are 3 layers of meninges actually. The outer layer is called dura mater, and this dura mater is attached to the inner aspect of the bone. Then you get the arachnoid mater. Then inside you get the pia mater. So you get dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. So then these are the 3 layers. So the brain and the spinal cord is inside the pia mater, shown in yellow color. This pia mater is firmly attached to the surface of the brain and the spinal cord. Dura mater is firmly attached to the bone outside, skull or the vertebral column. Arachnoid mater, it lies on the brain, as you can see here. It lies on the surface of the brain, but it is not firmly attached to the surface. So this is another way in which you can show it. So you have the dura mater closely attached to the skull here, and you get the arachnoid mater underneath that. Then you get the pia mater. So as I said before, it is on the surface attached to the brain. So when there are these grooves, which are called sulci, we will discuss it later. When there are sulci or grooves on the brain, in such places, pia mater goes in with the surface of the brain because it is firmly attached to the surface of the brain. So that is one point that you need to remember. Then the other thing is, inside the brain, it's not completely filled with brain substance. There are cavities which are called ventricles. So this is one ventricle that we have drawn, and the ventricles are lined by a cell layer called ependymal cell layer. So outside you get meninges here, then inside you get ependymal cell layer. So this ventricle is filled with the fluid. Ventricles are filled with the fluid, which is called cerebrospinal fluid. And that same fluid fills the gap between the arachnoid mater and pia mater. So this space is connected to this space in certain places, not through the brain substance, but there are certain places where the 2 spaces are connected. Now I'll tell you a few more things here, even though it's not there in the slide. Now this, since you have these 3 layers of meninges, dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater, we can define certain spaces between these layers of meninges. Okay, now if the skull is like this, there is a potential space between the skull and the dura mater, that is outside the dura mater, which is called extradural space. Extradural space or epidural space. Both are the same, extradural or epidural space. Then the space between the arachnoid mater and dura mater, since it is under the dura mater, it is called subdural space. Subdural space. Then the space between the arachnoid mater and pia mater, this one is called, since it is below the or deep to the arachnoid mater, it is called subarachnoid. It is also subarachnoid space. So you have an extradural or epidural space, subdural space, and subarachnoid space. So in the subarachnoid space, you get the cerebrospinal fluid, which is also found in the ventricles of the brain, CSF. Remember that point. We'll get back to the dura mater again in another slide. Now, when it comes to main divisions of the brain, one way of classifying the brain into different parts is this: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. This classification is useful when we learn the developmental aspect of the brain, developmental anomalies, and such things. This classification is important: forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain classification. But from a clinical point of view, this forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain classification is not so important and useful. Therefore, we will classify the brain in a different way. Now, in this classification, forebrain is also called cerebrum. This classification you call the forebrain cerebrum. Now here, if I get back here, the forebrain consists of the two large cerebral hemispheres on either side, left and right cerebral hemispheres, plus a small area hidden inside the two cerebral hemispheres in the center, which is called the diencephalon. So these two will constitute the forebrain. Then midbrain is a very small area. Then the hindbrain includes the cerebellum, pons, and medulla. Three structures: cerebellum, pons, and medulla forms hindbrain. Now, in the second classification, which is a more clinically relevant classification, again the forebrain is called cerebrum here. Therefore, it consists of the two cerebral hemispheres and the diencephalon hidden inside, which we can't see outside. So it's the same. But when it comes to the second part, it's a combination of midbrain, pons, and medulla together in this case. Midbrain is taken with part of the hindbrain, and you call it brainstem. So midbrain, pons, medulla is taken together and called brainstem. And the cerebellum is taken separately in that classification. Now, in the previous classification, cerebellum was taken under hindbrain here. And in this classification, cerebellum is taken separately. So you have, in the end, you have a cerebrum and you have a brainstem and a cerebellum. So 1, 2, and 3 structures. So there are a lot of clinical problems associated with the brainstem. Then there are clinical issues associated with the cerebellum and cerebrum itself. Cerebrum, once you classify it as cerebrum, brainstem, and cerebellum, cerebrum is the largest part of the brain compared to the other two parts, and it is situated in the anterior and middle cranial fossae. Because if you draw the skull, your skull would be like this. So you have some cranial fossae like this: anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossae. So the anterior and middle cranial fossae is occupied by the cerebrum, and in the posterior cranial fossa you get the cerebellum. and the brainstem passes between the two. We'll come back to it later. Now the cerebrum, as I said before, has two parts, two large cerebral hemispheres, left and right cerebral hemispheres on either side, and a diencephalon, mainly consisting of thalamus, you must have heard about these terms, and hypothalamus, hidden between the two cerebral hemispheres. I'll show you. Now, this is a sagittal section of the diagram of a sagittal section of the brain. Here, this whole area is the cerebral hemisphere. Whole area is the cerebral hemisphere, and you can see between the two cerebral hemispheres, this area is called the diencephalon, which is in the center. Now, below this line, below this orange colored line, you get the brainstem here. This is the brainstem up to the foramen magnum. Below that, you get the spinal cord. Then behind the brainstem, you get the cerebellum. Behind the brainstem, you get the cerebellum. So this is how it is. And if you put the other cerebral hemisphere on top of this like this, you cover the diencephalon. So to see the diencephalon, either you have to dig into this lateral wall of the cerebral hemisphere so that you get the diencephalon on that side. In this case, the left diencephalon can be seen by digging into the left cerebral hemisphere, or you can actually cut in the center through the sagittal suture plane. If you cut through the sagittal plane, you will separate the two cerebral hemispheres, left and right one. Then you can easily see the diencephalon hidden inside. So the cerebral hemispheres are the major parts of the cerebrum, as we saw in the previous slide, and they are separated by a mid-sagittal fissure called longitudinal cerebral fissure. So you get this mid-sagittal fissure in this area. This is called longitudinal cerebral fissure, and this fissure contains what is called falx cerebri. Okay, of course, there are anterior cerebral arteries. We'll discuss that later, not now. You get this falx cerebri. Falx cerebri is actually an extension of the dura mater. This is an extension of the, I'll change the color. Now, this is, you can see the dura mater here. So this is falx cerebri is an extension of the dura mater. So it dips down into the longitudinal cerebral fissure. You can see that. Now, similarly, the dura mater. Now here, this is a coronal section. This is a sagittal section. This is a sagittal section. In this sagittal section, you can see there is another extension of dura mater, a horizontal extension here, which is called tentorium cerebelli. So this is how you see it in the coronal section, tentorium cerebelli, which separates the cerebrum above from the cerebellum below. So this is the posterior cranial fossa area where the cerebellum lies. Then these two the two areas are separated by the tentorium cerebelli, which is again an extension of the dura mater. This dura mater, another point that I need to raise here, the dura mater has two layers actually. Now, if you take the skull like this is the skull. If this is dura mater, which is firmly attached to the inner aspect of the skull, in certain places it gets separated out like this into two layers. One layer on the attached to the bone, other layer is on the side of the brain. It's not attached to the brain, but it's on the side of the brain. Now, the same thing happens here where the falx cerebri is formed, even though I have not drawn there. Okay. And this space is filled with blood, venous blood. We'll discuss that later. So you get the two layers of dura mater separated out in certain places to form these dural venous sinuses. Now, these two layers of dura mater are called, now this the inner layer is called meningeal layer, outer layer is called endosteal layer. Okay, meningeal and endosteal layers. Meningeal layer is the inner layer, then outer layer is called endosteal layer. Now on the surface of the brain, there are folds or ridges that are called gyri, and there are grooves or fissures called sulci. This gyri and sulci actually increase the surface area of the outer part of the brain, which is called the cortex of the cerebral hemispheres. So if you have the cerebral hemisphere like this, you will get this gyri and sulci. So these ridges are called gyri. These are gyri and these are sulci. So this increases the surface area of the brain. So this part of the brain, the outer part of the brain, is called cortex. This is the cortex, which is formed by cell bodies. Then hemispheres are divided into lobes. Now you have two cerebral hemispheres like this. Now each of these two cerebral hemispheres, if you draw it like this, by sulci, there are different sulci divided into 4 lobes. Now the main sulci are the central sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus, and the lateral sulcus. So these are sulci. So you can identify several sulci here. These are all sulci. And these are gyri. You can see so many gyri. So this is central sulcus. This is parieto-occipital sulcus, and this is the lateral sulcus. So this is how the lobes are defined. In front of the central sulcus, you get the frontal lobe. Then between the central sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus, you get the parietal lobe. And below the lateral sulcus, you get the temporal lobe. Lateral sulcus separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe here. So you get frontal lobe, parietal lobe, behind and below the parieto-occipital sulcus, you get the occipital lobe, and then below the lateral sulcus, you get the temporal lobe. So you get on the left side, you get 4 lobes like this, and on the right side of the cerebral hemisphere also, you get the 4 lobes like this. And you usually, when they name these lobes, they have named it according to the bone that is overlying, the skull bone that is overlying the bone. So you get the frontal bone in that area, you get the parietal bone in this area, you get the occipital bone in this area, and the temporal bone in that area. So that's how they have named these lobes of the brain. Then when it comes to the cerebellum, cerebellum also has 2 hemispheres which are called cerebellar hemispheres. Someone is typing. So how do you separate the temporal lobe and occipital lobe? Temporal lobe is below the lateral sulcus. Occipital lobe is below the parieto-occipital sulcus. You can identify this parieto-occipital sulcus and the lateral sulcus. Lateral sulcus is anyway very clear. Central sulcus is also clear. Parieto-occipital sulcus is not very clear, but an experienced person can identify the parieto-occipital sulcus somewhere here, not in this diagram. Okay, it's not clear in this diagram, I understand. But on the other hand, even though you divide it like this, when it comes to functional things, you might have, overriding, overlapping areas. Okay, it's not 100%. So structurally, this is a very structural classification. Okay, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, and some of these sulci are not very clear. Okay, so you can see this in the practical session. Okay, now these are these cranial fossae. if you look at the cranial cavity, the base of the cranial cavity, you get the anterior cranial fossa here, and you get the middle cranial fossa there, and the posterior cranial fossa in this area. So in this sagittal view, you can sagittal rather, you know, it's the lateral side of the skull has been removed for you to see the different cranial fossae. So you get the anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. You get the extension of the dura mater between these two, as I said, so which is called tentorium cerebelli, separating the cerebellum, which is in the posterior cranial fossa, from the cerebral hemisphere in the middle and anterior cranial fossa. There are named gyri. There are so many gyri, but some of these gyri are important and they are given names. Now, one such gyrus is the precentral gyrus, and there's another one which is called the post-central gyrus. You can understand when you look at this name. So, this precentral gyrus should be, now if the central sulcus is like this, precentral gyrus should be in front of the central sulcus, and the post-central gyrus should be behind the central sulcus. Then you have superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri in the frontal lobe, superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri in the temporal lobe. I'll show you. Then you have what is called cingulate gyrus. On the, you can't see it on the lateral aspect. So when you draw the brain like this, the lateral aspect, you cannot see the cingulate gyrus. You have to cut this as a sagittal section to see it. Then you get the parahippocampal gyrus. So in this image of the lateral surface of the brain, you can identify most of these gyri except for two gyri that I have listed out. So you get the precentral gyrus, post-central gyrus on either side of the central sulcus here. Then you get superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri here, superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri, superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. So on the medial aspect of the brain in this sagittal section, you can identify the cingulate gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus. So to see the parahippocampal gyrus clearly, you have to cut off this part of the brain and remove the brainstem and the cerebellum, so that you will not have this part. So you can easily see the parahippocampal gyrus lateral to the brainstem. So in certain specimens, actually we cut it off here to show you the parahippocampal gyrus on the temporal lobe. That is the temporal lobe you get there. Then you can see another structure. Now now this is the cingulate gyrus. Just below the cingulate gyrus, you see the structure like this. So this is called corpus callosum. This is called corpus callosum. It consists of a lot of nerve fibers, many nerve fibers connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. Left and right cerebral hemispheres are connected together by the corpus callosum. We will discuss the details about the corpus callosum later. Different areas of the brain represents different functions, both motor and sensory. Now in front of the central sulcus here, in front of the central sulcus, we said it is precentral gyrus, this one. And that precentral gyrus is actually the primary or the main motor area. Primary motor area. And the gyrus behind the central sulcus, which is called the post-central gyrus, is the primary sensory area. Okay, not that. Primary sensory area. Primary sensory area. So in this primary motor area is responsible for the control of most of the skeletal muscles of the body. And the primary sensory area here behind the central sulcus, receives general sensory inputs, pain, temperature, touch, pressure, that kind of sensations uh, from the body, from most parts of the body. That's why you call it sensory area. But then, there are special areas for special sensory organs. Now, for instance, vision, even though it's drawn like this here, you get a calcarine sulcus here, another sulcus called calcarine sulcus. You can only see faintly on the lateral aspect, but you would see it clearly on the medial aspect. So on either side of the calcarine sulcus, you get the visual area, not here, not the whole area like this. Okay. So the visual area is there on either side of the calcarine sulcus, especially on the medial aspect of the brain when you take a sagittal section. Then on the superior temporal lobe, you get this area for hearing, which is called the auditory area. Now the taste area is here in the lower end of the post-central gyrus, but there are different descriptions about taste that goes with the limbic areas. We'll discuss that later. Then now this area, motor speech area, is an important area in the inferior frontal gyrus. We said there are different frontal gyrus, superior, middle and inferior frontal gyri. Now the motor speech area, which is also called Broca area, or sometimes it's called Broca's area, is in the inferior frontal gyrus, immediately in front of the primary motor cortex of the precentral gyrus. Immediately in front of that, you get the Broca area in the inferior frontal gyrus. Then there's another area, important area, which is called sensory speech area. This is motor speech area. This is sensory speech area. On the parietal lobe, which is also called, now this area is also called Wernike's area. Wernike's area or motor speech area. Now, for your speech, before you talk, you need to get inputs from auditory and visual areas. So you need to see things and you need to hear things to formulate your speech. What is done by this area. So to do that, you need to get these sensory inputs. So that is done by the Wernike's or more sensory speech area. Then, information is sent from this area to that area through a bundle of fibers. We will talk about it later. Okay. A bundle of fibers will take information from here to there. So these are called functional areas of the brain. If you are asked to indicate the functional areas of the brain on the lateral surface of the brain or the cerebral hemisphere, so these are the areas, the basic areas that you need to include. Now, the physiology department, when they start their lectures, they will discuss details about the Wernike's area and the Broca's area. So there's a lot of theory behind it, which is very relevant. So you will learn all these things when they discuss the function of the brain. Then this concept of homunculus. Now the homunculus is the map that shows how the body is represented in the brain. So therefore you have a sensory homunculus and a motor homunculus. Now if you look at this diagram, you can see certain areas of the body which are not so big. When it comes to representation of that area in the brain, large area of the brain is taken to represent the area of the body. Now, one example is the face. Now, face and the hand. Now, if you compare the size of the brain that is there to represent the hand, that is about that much, with the area that is there to represent the lower limb, it's almost the same. But if you compare the size of your hand and the whole of your lower limb, this is your whole lower limb. So the lower limb is several times bigger than the hand. But relatively, there's a large area of the brain responsible to control the hand. So when it comes to sensory also, even though it's a little bit less, it's comparatively in the sensory homunculus, compared to the lower limb, it's very close to the area of the lower limb. But when it comes to the motor, actually the hand area is bigger than the whole lower limb area. And even for the tongue, you can see a fairly large area. And remember these points, and it is represented upside down. Head is here, lower limbs are here, and the hands are here. So the person is represented head down, feet up, upside down in the homunculus. Then there's another point. Now this precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus, the primary motor and sensory areas, they are on the lateral surface of the brain. Okay, so it's on the lateral surface, and then very small part goes onto the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, if you take a mid-sagittal section here and look from that side, you will see this on the medial aspect of the brain. So the lower limb, especially the foot area, both the motor and sensory homunculus foot area is actually represented by this the sensory and motor cortices on the medial aspect of the brain. Remember that point. So if you get a lesion in this area, actually you will get sensory and motor effects on the feet.